I was been listening to all the previous speakers, and like many of them, I've also had that cold. And it's interesting how many of what they've said links into some of the points I was going to make. It's no coincidence, but it's almost reassuring when that happens. So some of the things I'm going to say will provide links almost to pretty well all the previous speakers, which is good. But from the perspective of a telecommunications company, BT, we are a CSP and an ISP, and as most people know, operate in pretty much every country in the world. So to start with, have a look at this. Now, you might think, what a ridiculous slide. It actually was based on market research. It's not just fiction. But it actually underpins the fact that the internet, the broadband service we have in the UK, consumers, is crucial to people's lives now. So majority of the audience are sort of blokes of an age. And therefore, it might not come as any surprise that some of those people might say, hey, no fruit and veg for me. But nonetheless, as a nation, we're talking UK now. This is research of a sort, perhaps not as rigorous as you might like. But the point is that cyber is not only a force for bad, as many of the speakers have been talking about, this little dark corner, but cyber itself is a force for good. And sometimes there's a risk we overemphasize the bad bit and forget the good bit. And that doesn't downplay the bad bit by any means. So just, you know, the internet, the fact we love broadband, the fact you've got access to services online, be they government services or commercial services or entertainment. That's really what it's all about, and we should not throw that away as our peril. So as a telco, we see both sides of that argument, the force for good and the force for bad. And what I just want to do next is just to try and present a sort of on the one hand, on the other hand, set of arguments about the risks that we are running and how you might think about yourselves presenting those when you yourselves do a version of this talk, which we all should be able to do. And that links to the sort of cyber strategy work. So just to know what I said, on the one hand, on the other hand. So on the one hand, there's some of the things that previous speakers have been talking about, including the last speaker, which are the black swan events that happen in the world. Now, black swans, I'm not going to do a teach-in, but remember, massively high impact, extremely low probability. So low that you haven't even thought of these things, and hence black swan. Before black swans were discovered, everyone thought they were white. But the sort of examples of black swan event are clearly dreadful things like the tsunami just over a year ago. And at Christmas before last, nobody would have predicted the fact that the world might be having a nuclear catastrophe because of a tsunami. Now, that's not a cyber event, and you could argue similarly the Arab Spring and Libya and Syria now, nor are they, but they are examples of black swans. If you then bring it closer in as to what's a black swan in our world of cyber or of telecoms for me, then Ross a moment ago was picking up on some of those things. There's lots of examples. Certainly, if you were watching telly a week ago, you'd have seen the thing about solar flares in 2012 and sunspots. So you might associate cyber mainly with malware and information network security. But just remember, EMP and sunspots and electromagnetic pulse events are also cyber. So the fact that in 2012 we've got a big load of stuff coming up, as we also have the Olympics coming up, which I'll talk about later, is potentially a big deal. But even closer to home, I mean, there's the Sony thing people have been talking about ever since it happened. Ditto the RSA token compromise, another major event, black swan for those companies. And I think about what would be the one for BT. Well, black swans, you don't know because they haven't happened yet and you can't think of them. But what would be seriously impacting for what we are, which is the world's 5th or 6th largest data processor, would be loss of records, obviously, like anyone else. And if we think of regulation such as the payment card industry stuff, we hold serious numbers of millions of credit card records, we hold serious numbers of millions of bank account records. Were we to lose them all, you can do the sums, each one averages out at about 70 quid a loss, and we would face something like £1 billion incident. And a previous speaker mentioned, it was the crime speaker right at the beginning, similar sorts of huge numbers when they're adding up the cost of crime. So high impact, low probability, is that what it's all about in cyber? So that was on the one hand. And I think we'd probably all recognise that no, it isn't. Because on the other hand, is all this nonsense. It's the death by 1,000 cuts stuff. It's all the things that many other speakers have been talking about. Just the day-to-day drudge of having on your mobile or your laptop or your PC a load of nonsense that you really weren't expecting, be it spam, phishing stuff, things not working properly, and so on and so on. And the sort of, we heard earlier the expression, the advanced persistent threat, the APT, which is one way of encapsulating the slightly more serious end of that, although it doesn't have a proper definition as we know. But just multiple smaller events, sabotage, DDoS, malware, hacktivist, scam, spam, phishing, da-da-da-da-da, all those sort of things. But there's a tricky bit here, and that's this thing which I pointed out here on the left, which is FUD, the fear, uncertainty and doubt bit, the catch-22 bit. And some people have also alluded to that, and that is that our own industry, including my industry, our industry, makes money out of selling the sort of insurance end of all this. And therefore, you know, do you really know that that antivirus product you've got on your laptop that everyone's been advocating, do you need it? Or actually, have you already got 2 or 3? Or is the network provider already doing it for you? The consumer doesn't actually know, and yet we're making money out of it. So as we as a nation, or we as a telco, do better on this subject, we have to find different ways of making money that don't rely on the insurance sale, on the FUD stuff. That's quite hard when you're there to make money. So that's sort of on the one hand, on the other hand. And we also heard right at the start Ryan Cleary's name mentioned. He was the 19-year-old who was arrested for doing some sort of cyber stuff. You know, papers make him out to be some sort of genius. He wasn't, he was just a little cog in a big wheel. And those sort of people, humans, are in this mix. We'll come back to him again. So I mentioned the Olympics. I'm not going to say much about the Olympics. There's a few famous faces on there, Foreign Secretary and our Minister. And it's pretty obvious there's all sorts of scams going on around that. Somebody spoke about that as well. But the point here, of course, with now talking for BT as one of the main sponsors of the Olympics, is we're doing the IT infrastructure. So it's very much a showcase for the company, it's a showcase for the nation. And we're taking it as seriously as you can imagine. So in every dimension, this is bigger than Beijing. I'm talking about the IT now, because people are now wandering around with mobile phones that take videos, for example, 100 meters final. They're all going to go off. Everyone's doing a video stream. So think of the scaling of the pipes we have to put in to cover that, as well as just all the other stuff, all the phones, all the access points, all the SIM cards, all this, that, and the other that you can imagine for the Olympic environment, in a place that will attract the attention of the world. Now, which of the threat actors are going to hit on that? Your guess is as good as ours, but the probability would probably be less at the state end, but ramping up through the serious crime end and the trivial crime end, and perhaps the hacktivist end of wanting to do a defacement or make some political point. So right from the web apps, right through the infrastructure, the hosting, and right down to the wires in the road is a massive deal. So the Olympics is occupying a lot of our minds at the moment. So if I put some of that together, what are we doing in the industry to respond to some of those legitimate concerns that are just articulated by some of those logos I put up there? And those are things from GSOL, from the Family Online Safety Institute, that was Get Safe Online, from GCHQ, cyberbullying, this problem, Facebook, people who mentioned, and so on. So what are we doing to respond to all that stuff that's going on, saying, come on BT, or come on industry, can you do better? We also have the National Cyber Strategy. Lord West talked about that right at the beginning. I'm not going to dwell on that in particular. Just to remind you of the 4 pillars, though, or the 4 objectives on crime, resilience, and then the third one, which is where I started, which is all about making Britain a great place to do business, the positive side of life, and then the cross-cutting one, which is about skills and educating the citizen. Now, if you look at cybersecurity strategies, the other one there is from America. From across the world, most countries have one. It's not just the UK and the US. It is pretty well everywhere, whether you're on the west looking towards the east or the east looking towards the west. And one of the common themes they all have is this thing about educating the citizen. How on earth do you upskill a nation so that the policemen do know what to do when you report an e-crime, so that kids at school don't get themselves into trouble? It's all obvious stuff, and yet we're talking more than doing on that subject. And I think some of the common themes that have emerged, John Bassett was mentioning, and John indeed was mentioning as well, some of the campaign type ideas people have. Do you link it to stuff like the seatbelts campaign, or AIDS, or drink drive, or smoke alarms, you know, £4 smoke alarm versus 20 grand fire engine, or the smoking campaign, the non-smoking campaign? All those things have merit that perhaps we could use and capitalise on and get ideas from for educating the citizen. And of course, we're increasingly talking about the Brian Cox factor. You need one fantastic figurehead, and suddenly people find physics interesting in the nation just because he was on the telly. What's the cyber equivalent? Product placement on Coronation Street, EastEnders. There's lots of ideas going on as to how we could do better on all this. So how can industry help? Those are some of the words I've been using. We in industry, the telecoms industry, but industry generally, different from governments, have an expertise and a scale that governments can't match. So the trick of the National Cybersecurity Strategy in the UK, but other countries too, is to draw those together, the partnership approach of government with industry, but increasingly industry helping industry. Everything doesn't have to trombone back through government in this space. So if I think of what we've got, we in BT, what's our USP in this space? The fact that we've got one of the world's largest networks. So we have our own collateral, we have our own metadata. We don't need other people's, we've got our own. We know what's going on out there, and we can use that for common good. And if we collaborate with other ISPs, other CSPs, mobile providers and so on, and we lever all the professionals we have in the nation, and indeed the world in this space, because sometimes these are world scale issues, the industry bodies and academia and the professional institutions, together the whole's greater than the sum of the parts. That's not just a cliche, I think it's true in this space. So that's the how. And the where, so, you know, let's get specific. What are some of the things that we can actually do? Some have already been alluded to, and they're always put down in perhaps they're too hard or politically difficult. And well, some of that's true as well. But building in network defences so that people who connect to the ISP or the CSP already have a level of defence that they might not have expected, and that improves the brand. So you can defend your DNS to get specific. You can put in DDoS. You can put in IDS, IPS. You can do a whole range of things. Heuristics, in other words, you know what the norm is. You know what the deviances from the norms are. That people may already assume are in there, but it's patchy. We've had a ton of stuff today about endpoint security and mobile devices. We've had things about how do you monitor to find out when you're infected or not. The angsty one at the moment in the press and politically, of course, is blocking the balance between protecting people from themselves, but on the other hand, not turning into a sort of North Korea or Iran environment of a walled garden. And the politics around that are hard. The politics around what people have called the Big Brother database is hard in the UK. And I think getting that right through legal, political, regulatory, and all of those difficult things that we have to do with governments is the trick, and is somewhere that we can work together and bring that to the table. So in terms of the consumer, it's pretty obvious that our consumer and small to medium enterprise customers are in that space of being vulnerable. Most of the speakers have talked about it. And I've just mentioned there are practical opportunities here for building large-scale network defences. And I suspect the appetite is reasonably positive for that, as long as we don't go too far. We were at a discussion the other day about universal credit, which is the next generation of replacements for all the credits you get from Department of Work and Pensions and ditto other government departments. Thinking about, as we want citizens to get that sort of service online, what do you do, for example, if the device that's connecting is in itself infected? And perhaps that the benefits you get and get downloaded to your device are then nicked by serious crime because of malware. Well, there's a culture that says, well, you give it them again. It's like losing and being defrauded on your bank account. How on earth, without penalising the most vulnerable citizens, do we change that mindset for people to look after their devices? Or should we at all? Should it just work, the endpoint device? Why are we putting the onus on the citizen? So the ISP, the CSP can provide network defences, and the operating system and handset manufacturers could do better on the endpoint devices. Is that enough? Well, it's an arms race. It may not be enough, but it's more than we have at the moment. The obvious driver that everybody signs up to in this space, sort of one extreme, as it were, that people think we really must do, is keeping the illegal material out, keeping children safe online. So we have a good starting point. We do a lot of that at the moment already across the industry through these sort of institutions and bodies. But moving that from blocking illegal to having sensible parental controls is quite a step, because we're not in that space yet. So finally, I mentioned the guy who was arrested, Ryan Cleary. Well, one of the things we certainly are doing in the industry through corporate social responsibility and volunteering and just general good stuff is some of the things that have emerged, like the Cybersecurity Challenge and Young Persons Network Global for Cyber Champions, Cyber Guardians, Cyber Prefects, educating kids, in other words. And the aim of those sort of bodies, which everybody I come across supports universally, is to try and make sure that the guys who would have gone on the dark side actually end up on the bright side and become some of our next generation of experts and enthusiasts and engineers in this space. Isn't that a nice goal? There's a fantastic picture here. I was lucky enough to be sitting at a table with Mr. Millican, who was this year's winner a week last Sunday of this year's Cybersecurity Challenge. And it does a credit to us all. So I think that's where I'll end, John. Enough from me, and thank you very much indeed.
Well, it's always a cracking presentation.